Check that you have all of your patterns, your back, your front, your placket, and your sleeve cuff, your skirt and your pocket, your sleeve and your collar. Let's start with the necktie. Fold it into half. Iron and sew 1 centimeter from the folded edge. Grab a pair of scissors and trim away the seam allowances so only about 0.5 cm of seam allowance is left. Using a loop turner or any other tool, turn the necktie inside out. Repeat for the other panel. Place the facing on top of the front panel and sew along the sewing line. Reduce the stitch length to prevent the fabric from tearing later on. Grab a pair of scissors and slice into the fabric along the center front line. So that's just a straight line down. Avoid cutting into your stitches. Flip the facing through the opening and iron well. Sew the front and back top panels together at the sides and shoulders with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Measure and mark 1 centimeter from the neck down. From that 1 centimeter mark, unpick about 4 stitches downwards to create a hole for the necktie to go in. Then insert the necktie through the opening. Seal the hole back up. Base the facing to the front along the waist with a 0.5 cm seam allowance. Sew the collar along the bottom with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the seam allowances to reduce tension and bulk. Spread open the panels, and on the uninterfaced side, we're going to sew an understitch. Make sure that you're catching onto the seam allowances below. Let's sew the collar to the neckline. With the right sides of the collar facing up, flip open the facing and place the collar so that it matches up along the center front. Match up the notch on the collar to the shoulder seam. Sandwich this with the facing on the top. Sew from the center front all the way to the shoulder seam with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. When you're done, flip it open to take a look. It should look something like this. Let's repeat the steps for the other side. Move the collar to the other side, making sure that the collar is not twisted. Open up the facing and position the start of the collar to the seam. Sandwich the collar by flipping the facing so that it's on top and align the notch on the collar to the shoulder seam. So with a 1 cm seam allowance stopping exactly at the shoulder seam. Push away the top layer of the collar. Do not sew onto that. The rest of the layers will be sewing from the shoulder point to the shoulder point with a 1 cm seam allowance. Grab a pair of scissors and trim into the seam allowances to reduce the bulk and tension. I start from the edge towards the shoulder seam and then the other side as well. Then exactly where the shoulder seam is, I'm going to make an additional snip on both sides. Lastly, snip into the seam allowances along the middle section. Here, push up the seam allowances and iron well. Flip up the edge of the collar so that it covers the stitching line below. Iron well. So on the right side in the ditch where the seam is, from shoulder to shoulder. On the sleeve panel, transfer the marking from the paper pattern onto the fabric. Baste 0.5 cm around the marking. Grab a pair of scissors and snip into the marking. Be careful not to cut onto any of the stitching line. To sew the sleeve placket, spread open that slit that we've just made so that it makes a straight line. We're going to attach it while it's stretched out like this. Straighten the placket. Place the placket underneath and we'll be sewing at 0.5 cm. Try to straighten it as much as possible, especially in the center. Fold the placket along the lines on the paper pattern, so that will be 1 cm, 1 cm. Tuck the seam allowance inwards and make sure that the edge of the fabric covers the stitching line. If not, just refold and iron. Then top stitch close to the edge. So close to the edge. Fold the placket into half. And at the top, sew down at an angle. With the opening facing the side seam, baste along the bottom with a 0.5 cm seam allowance to prevent it from flipping up. Fold the sleeve cuff into half and sew down the sides with a 1 cm seam allowance. Make sure to keep the edges folded down by 1 cm and sew it down. Turn it inside out and iron well. Fold the sleeve into half and sew along the side seam with a 1 cm seam allowance. Along the circumference of the bottom of the sleeve, sew 2 rows of gathering stitches. Gently gather the stitches to reduce the circumference of the sleeve to match the size of the sleeve cuff. Align the sleeve cuff with the sleeve placket and sew just 1 layer of the cuff to the sleeve with a 1 cm seam allowance. When you're done, it will look something like this. Similar to the collar, we're going to hide the seam allowances by pushing them into the sleeve cuff, so that would be downwards, and iron well. Fold the edge of the remaining sleeve cuff so that it covers the stitching line. Iron well. Sew in the ditch on the right side to catch the folded edge. Sew 2 rows of gathering stitches along the sleeve crown. Then attach the sleeve to the armhole, ensuring to gather most of the fabric near the shoulder seam. Sew the sleeve to the armhole with a 1 cm seam allowance. Overlock. Locate the notch on the skirt side seam and position the pocket just below it. Sew the pocket to the skirt with a 1 cm seam allowance. On only the front pocket and front skirt, understitch on the pocket. Sew the front skirt and the back skirt together along the side with a 1 cm seam allowance. For the hem or the bottom of the skirt, we're going to fold up 1 cm and iron well. Then sew it down with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. Along the top of the skirt, sew 2 rows of gathering stitches. Gently pull onto the stitch to reduce the width of the skirt to match the top. Sew the top and the skirt together with a 1 cm seam allowance. Make sure that the side seams match up. Sew up the elastic to a suitable size. Divide both the skirt and the elastic band into 4 quadrants. Mark and pin them together. Sew the elastic band to the edge of the skirt with a zigzag stitch. Make sure that all the markings align up by stretching slightly while sewing. Push the seam allowances upwards towards the top and iron well. Then on the right side of the fabric, catch onto the seams below. You're going to top stitch with a 0.8 cm seam allowance. Stretch as you go to ensure that the fabric stays flat. Sew buttonholes on the sleeve cuff and hand sew a couple of buttons according to the placement on the paper pattern. And there you have it. Your dress is completed.